There are certain inventions that don't merely perform a simple task, but they quietly rearrange the structure of society around them. They do their work not through spectacle, but through force multiplication. They take something that once existed in a limited quantity, a message, an image, a page of text, and they make it suddenly abundant. For centuries, the printing press had already possessed that transformative power. Since the age of Johannes Gutenberg, presses have produced books, pamphlets, and broadsides that travelled further and faster than any spoken word could hope to reach. Yet, even in the early 19th century, the process remained, in essence, stubbornly physical. A press was worked by human strength. Each sheet required the steady rhythm of hands, ink, pressure, and release. It was an art as much as an industry, deliberate, skilled, and limited ultimately by the endurance of the printer themselves. By the 19th century, it wasn't an age inclined towards limits anymore. Across Britain and Europe, the steam engine was already transforming mines, mills, and transport. Iron rails stitched together cities that had once felt distant from each other. Factories multiplied goods with a speed that earlier generations would have considered unnatural. In such a world, the slow cadence of the traditional hand press began to look less like craftsmanship and a lot more like inefficiency. And so, inevitably, someone asked the question: if steam could drive the locomotive, if steam could power the vast machinery of the textile mills, why should it not also power the printing press? The answer, when it arrived, would not simply make printing faster, it would alter the relationship between information and the public that consumed it. Newspapers that had once circulated in the thousands would soon appear in the tens of thousands. Political arguments, advertisements, scandals, and of course, serialized stories would all spill daily from machines whose appetite for paper seemed almost impatient. The printed word, once limited by the labour of the pressman, would begin to behave more like an industrial product. Tonight's object, then, is not merely a machine. It's a turning point in how societies communicate with themselves. The moment when printing ceased to be primarily a craft and became something closer to a continuous engine of information. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the steam-powered printing press, the machine that accelerated the circulation of words. I'm your host, Alex Sweetman, and this is the Old Money's Cabinet of Curiosities, where we examine the inventions, the enthusiasms, and the cultural artifacts that history would rather we just tidied quietly out of sight. On this programme, we don't confine ourselves to looking at individual objects, pristine behind single panes of glass. Instead, we step back to examine the ideas and the mechanisms that altered how society functions, often more quietly than their consequences would suggest. And few machines really altered the public life more profoundly than the printing press, especially once it was harnessed to steam. Tonight, we turn our attention to the time when ink, paper, and iron gears were all set in motion by the same power that drove the factories and locomotives of the industrial age, and the moment that the rhythmic thunder of the steam press began to move printed pages at a speed the 19th century had never seen before. Long before the press began to roar with the rhythm of steam pistons and iron cylinders, printing was a quieter, slower business, one that depended almost entirely on the strength and patience of the human body. The traditional printing press, descended in principle from the design attributed to Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century, remained remarkably unchanged for centuries. It relied on a simple mechanical idea: a screw press that forced carved wood or iron covered in ink, also known as inked type, firmly against a sheet of paper. The motion was controlled by a pressman pulling a long wooden bar, applying pressure through leverage and muscle. It was ingenious, but it was also by nature limited. A skilled printer working a hand press could produce perhaps 250 impressions in an hour under ideal conditions. Each sheet required individual placement. The type had to be inked again and again with leather-covered ink balls. And the press bed slid back and forth between the platen with a steady rhythm of craft, rather than the urgency of industry. Now, for pamphlets and books, this was acceptable. It was perfectly fine. But for newspapers, in a rapidly expanding city, it was becoming a problem. By the late 18th century, literacy was rising, and political debate was spreading beyond the coffee houses and parliamentary chambers out into the streets. Newspapers were no longer curiosities for just the wealthy. They were becoming instruments of influence, vehicles through which public opinion could be shaped. And yet, the equipment that produced them still belonged in an earlier world. Printers could add more presses, they could hire more pressmen, but the fundamental process refused to accelerate beyond the limits of human endurance. A newspaper editor who hypothetically wished to reach 10,000 readers needed not merely good writing, but they needed an army of labourers and a press room filled with clattering wood and iron. This bottleneck did not go unnoticed. The Industrial Revolution had already demonstrated that human labour could be multiplied through machinery. In textile mills, spinning frames and power looms had transformed thread and cloth production with an almost unsettling speed. Steam engines pumped mines dry and drove factory shafts that powered dozens of machines simultaneously. It was difficult in such an environment to look at the printing press and not see it as an anachronism. Why, some wondered, should the spread of information be constrained by the muscles of a pressman, when the age had already discovered how to harness steam? There was, however, another quieter tension beneath the mechanical one. Governments had long understood the power of the printed word. Newspapers and pamphlets could inflame political passions. They could circulate scandal. They could spread ideas far beyond the reach of official oversight. And for centuries, authorities had attempted to regulate printing through licensing laws, stamp duties, and censorship. A faster press didn't just promise efficiency, it threatened amplification. A machine capable of producing thousands of sheets in an hour wouldn't simply print newspapers more quickly. It could multiply the speed at which opinion, criticism, and agitation could circulate amongst the public. And so, the early attempts to mechanise printing carried a faint whiff of unease along with them. The technology promised enormous commercial opportunity for publishers, but it also hinted at something more disruptive: the possibility that information itself might become an industrial force. Once unleashed, it'd be difficult to slow it down again. At first glance, the question of why the printing press was eventually harnessed onto steam appears almost embarrassingly straightforward. Demand was rising, hand presses were slow, and the industrial age possessed both the machinery and the appetite to improve them. Case closed. But history rarely moves forwards on logic alone. By the early 19th century, Britain had developed a rather insatiable appetite for printed material. Newspapers circulated increasingly detailed reports of parliamentary debates, shipping news, market prices, and scandal with increasing enthusiasm. Pamphlets argued politics. Advertisements announced everything from patent medicines to theatrical performances, and even the most respectable household might find itself acquiring printed matter at a rate that would have astonished earlier generations. The difficulty, however, was that demand had begun to outpace the traditional machinery of printing. The hand press, as reliable as it was, it imposed limits that couldn't easily be negotiated. Each impression required careful inking, positioning, and pressure. And the skilled pressmen, they did work with impressive efficiency, but even the most industrious print shop could only increase production by adding more presses and more labour. Eventually, the room itself becomes the limiting factor. You can only fit So many wooden presses and perspiring printers beneath a single roof. There's just no more space. Newspaper proprietors, meanwhile, had discovered something unsettling about their total business model. The value of news declines rapidly with time. Yesterday's news was already half obsolete by the morning after. Faster a paper could be printed and distributed, the more valuable the contents became. Speed, in other words, was beginning to matter almost as much as accuracy. At the same moment, the Industrial Revolution was quietly demonstrating that speed could be engineered. As mentioned before, steam engines allowed the textile mills to produce cloth in quantities far exceeding just a generation earlier. Iron foundries as well multiplied the output of metalwork. Transport was beginning to accelerate as canals, improved roads, and eventually the railways shortened the distances, or at least the feeling of distances, between cities. Printing stood awkwardly among these innovations, still dependent on a machine whose basic principles remained largely unchanged since the 15th century. It didn't require an especially radical imagination to wonder whether the press might benefit from the same mechanical enthusiasm that had already transformed these other trades. The incentives weren't just purely technological either. Newspapers faced financial pressures that rewarded scale. The more copies a publisher could produce, the more advertisements could be sold, and the wider the circulation would become. A press capable of producing thousands of sheets in a single hour wouldn't simply improve the efficiency, it would reshape the economics of publishing. Of course, not everyone welcomed that prospect. Printers trained in the traditions of the craft regarded mechanization with understandable suspicion. After all, machines that could multiply output also threatened to multiply redundancy. If iron cylinders could perform the work of several pressmen simultaneously, one would be reasonable to question what would happen to the pressmen themselves. Still, the reality of the industrial age had a habit of advancing regardless of such concerns. Once a technology promised greater speed, greater output, greater profit, resistance tended to become a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent barrier. By the opening decades of the 19th century, the stage had been quietly set. The demand for printed information was growing, the economics of newspapers rewarded scale, steam power had already proven its ability to multiply human labour. All that remained was for someone to combine these ingredients in a way that printers and the readers could no longer ignore. If the steam-powered printing press appears, in hindsight, to be the inevitable child of the Industrial Revolution, its arrival and birth was anything but smooth. Machines rarely introduced themselves politely, and this one in particular had a habit of alarming the very people whose trade it threatened to transform. At the centre of this story stands a man who was not, strictly speaking, an English printer at all. He was a German engineer, Friedrich Koenig. Now, Koenig arrived in London in the early years of the 19th century, with the conviction that printing could be mechanised in much the same way that the textile production industry had been. The traditional printing press relied on downwards pressure of the screw mechanism, but Koenig's new design replaced that motion with rotating cylinders driven by mechanical power. Instead of a single impression made by human strength, the sheets would be passed continuously through the machine while rollers inked the type automatically. It was in principle exactly the kind of improvement that the industrial economy specialised in. It was faster, it was more consistent, and it was capable of operating on a scale orders of magnitude larger. In practice, however, introducing such a machine into the printing trade was rather delicate. Koenig was lucky and found an ally in Thomas Barnes, and more importantly, in the proprietors of the Times, one of the most influential newspapers in Britain. The paper had every incentive to accelerate its printing. Circulation was expanding, news was travelling quickly, and being the first to press carried obvious advantages. But there was a problem. The printers who worked the hand presses were powerful within the organisation, and many of them viewed the mechanisation with that deep suspicion that we mentioned before. If word spread too early that a machine capable of replacing several of their members at once was being installed, to say the response might be spirited would be a bit of an understatement. So, the solution adopted by the management of the Times was not to announce the invention triumphantly. It was to install it quietly. Very quietly. In 1814, Koenig's steam-powered press was assembled within the newspaper's printing office under conditions that modern readers might reasonably describe as industrial secrecy. Only a handful of trusted individuals knew the full purpose of the machine that was being prepared. The regular pressmen, meanwhile, continued their work on the traditional presses, unaware that a mechanical rival was being readied nearby. Then, in the early hours of the 29th of November 1814, the experiment became a reality. That morning's edition of the Times was printed not on the hand presses, but by Koenig's steam-powered machine. It produced thousands of copies at a speed that would have been impossible for the traditional equipment. Only once the edition had been safely printed did the proprietors inform their staff what had happened. The announcement was delivered, if you can believe it, rather bravely, within the paper itself. The issue carried a notice explaining that the newspaper had been printed by the greatest improvement connected with printing since the discovery of the art itself. One can only imagine the expressions of the press room when that news was read. Now, Koenig, for his part, did not become a household name. Inventors of industrial machinery rarely did. Yet his work marked the beginning of a transformation that would spread across Europe and America. Steam presses multiplied the output of newspaper, accelerated the spread of books and literacy and pamphlets, and they laid the mechanical foundations for the mass media of the 19th century. And it all began with this machine assembled quietly in the night, because its creators suspected, probably correctly, that not everyone would welcome it. Now, while the steam-powered printing press began its life in secrecy, assembled quietly behind the walls of a newspaper office, the consequences of its creation proved anything but discreet. Once the principle had been successfully demonstrated, the transformation of the industry was swift. Machines based on the designs of Friedrich Koenig, and those that followed him, spread like wildfire. Iron cylinders replaced the wooden patterns, rollers inked type automatically, and the presses no longer paused politely between impressions. They ran, instead, with the steady determination of industrial machinery. For publishers, the implications were irresistible. Newspapers could be printed in quantities that earlier generations would have regarded as fantastical. A publication that once struggled to produce a few thousand copies could now reach tens of thousands of readers in a single morning. The economics of the press changed almost overnight because of this. Larger circulations attracted more advertisements. More advertisements, in turn, funded larger editions. Information, in other words, had become scalable. The consequences extended far beyond the printing room. Faster press meant faster news. Political debates travelled further and faster than ever before. Commercial information spread between cities with increasing speed, and public opinion, that elusive and occasionally troublesome force, began to move with a new momentum. The steam-powered press didn't invent newspapers, nor did it create public debate, both of those existed beforehand, but it accelerated them both so dramatically that they began to feel like entirely new phenomena. What had once been a craft industry, producing printed matter in measured quantities, had become something closer to a system for the rapid circulation of information, one that could feed an expanding an increasingly literate society with a constant supply of words. Unlike many machines of the Industrial Revolution, it quietly altered the balance of power in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Once the machinery existed and was producing information at scale, the question was no longer whether the public would read more. The question changed to who controls the presses and who controls the information they're producing. Which makes the steam-powered printing press a rather fitting specimen for the cabinet. It's not merely a machine of iron and steam, but instead an instrument that helped transform printing from a patient craft into the restless machinery of mass communication. A system that still hums quietly in the background of modern life. If you've enjoyed this excursion into the mechanical acceleration of words, do consider subscribing to the podcast so that you don't miss the next object we retrieve from the shelves. And likewise, if you know someone who shares a fondness for the stranger corners of history, you might also consider passing the programme along to them. Until next time, thank you for joining me in the Old Money's Cabinet of Curiosities. As always, I remain your faithful guide. Farewell.